Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Each month I do a digital discussion, and this month it's on the enslaved of George Washington's household. Let's get started. I'm in front of a picture of Mount Vernon at roughly at the time of where some of the enslaved lived there. And there were actually at least five different buildings, large buildings there, including Mount Vernon. And I'll talk about this painting later on in my discussion. The Enslaved of George Washington's Household. And I want to tell you a quick story. I've decided I was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. New Hampshire is my home state. Oh, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I saw an advertisement about a woman named Ona Judge. Ona Judge was an enslaved of George Washington's who escaped and ended up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I'll tell you more about her later. But that intrigued me, and I always wanted to share her story. But then I decided I wanted to share a few more stories. There's many more that are yet to be shared. Let me go back. I got a little ahead of myself. And I want to mention that at the end, you will be able in the chat or question and answer, but the chat is just as easy. If you have a comment, please let me know or question. I'll do my best to answer it. I have an hour and 15 minutes total, so I'll try to be timely since I tend to like to talk. When George Washington's father, Augustine, died in 1743, George inherited enslaved people at the age of, he was 11 years old. Additionally, his father left him a 280-acre farm outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia. That is not where Mount Vernon is. He was also left 10 enslaved people in his father's will, and as a young man, Washington purchased at least 8 more enslaved people, including a carpenter named Kit. Washington purchased more enslaved people in 1755, including 4 men, 2 women, and a child. And I will talk about this engraving also later on of the Washington family because it's significant. And here's a picture, a painting of Martha I'd never seen before. And if I know the credit, I try to list it on here as to who painted it and when. And that's Martha about the time of her wedding, marriage to George Washington. And this is at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. There are about 317 enslaved people living at Mount Vernon by 1799. 123 people were owned by George Washington. Another 153 enslaved people were owned by the Custis estate. When Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died in 1757 without a will, she received a lifetime interest in 1/3 of his estate, including enslaved. It was after his marriage to Martha Dainridge Custis in January of 1759 that the number of enslaved increased dramatically. Neither George or Martha could free the Custis. They are called dower slaves, dower enslaved. They couldn't free them according to the law, which I'm assuming is the law of Virginia, but it could have been the law of the country. I'm guessing it was the law of Virginia at that time. And upon Martha's death, they returned to the Custis estate and were divided among her grandchildren. And the hard part about this is there's not photographs, so I have to rely on paintings or drawings or whatever I could find to illustrate this for you. George Washington, the father of our country, had no biological children of his own. But during his nearly 40-year marriage to Martha, he reigned over Mount Vernon, filled with Martha's children and grandchildren. And according to them, he was a beloved father figure. I'm just trying to paint a background here for you. We will get to talking about the main focus of this. Martha's 2 oldest children had died by the time she remarried, which tragically was not uncommon then. due to disease, but Washington became the legal guardian of her two youngest children, 4-year-old John Park Custis, known as Jackie, and 2-year-old Martha Park Custis, known as Patsy. And no, he never legally adopts them, but he's definitely their guardian. Patsy had epilepsy. Despite receiving the best treatments available, Patsy died in the summer of 1773 after a seizure. She was only 17 years old. During the Revolutionary War, the military victory over the British at Yorktown in 1781 was overshadowed by the loss of Martha's only remaining child. Jack, or Jackie as he was sometimes called, died at Yorktown of camp fever. It was a disease that spread at the age of 27, and he left behind his wife, Eleanor Calvert Custis, and their 4 children. While mourning, and sorry about that, I don't know how I spelled that, Mourning, the loss of Jack, the next 6 years had happy times at Mount Vernon, where the Washingtons raised 2 of their 4 grandchildren. So their daughter-in-law allowed them to do that. And they had a relationship with all 4. But I can't imagine letting someone raise 2 of my children. Eleanor, known as Nellie Park Custis, and George Washington, Washy Park Custis. And I'll tell you a little bit about Washy later on and how he's connected to somebody in our historic future. And this is the life of George Washington, the farmer, a portrait of George Washington. And I cut off some of that, just the way the slide came up, but you saw all of it at the beginning. And that shows George with a white overseer, and some enslaved who were most likely field hands that worked outside. After his brother Lawrence died and Lawrence's widow, Washington inherited Mount Vernon, the place that we most often associate with him. That was a 2,000-acre estate located high above the Potomac River in northern Virginia. And during the 16 years between his marriage and the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Washington bought about 40 additional enslaved. After that time, most of the increases in the enslaved at Mount Vernon were due to the large number of children born at Mount Vernon. And I wanted to focus a little bit on how Washington treated people during the Revolutionary War, including the enslaved and free Blacks. And then we'll get to the rest of our topic. And this is called Soldiers in Uniform, another painting by Jean Baptiste. And it's the Revolutionary War. At the start of the Revolutionary War in 1775, General Washington and the highest ranking officers ejected Black soldiers, both free and enslaved, from the army, and they barred them from future enlistment. But Washington quickly changed his mind in 1776 after a direct appeal from Black troops who were very much dissatisfied at being discarded. At Valley Forge, Washington approved a plan to recruit Black troops. Later in the war, a foreign officer estimated that Black men made up 25% of Washington's army. Washington commanded the last integrated American army until the Korean War 150 years later. That's tragic. Washington allowed aides John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton to attempt raising battalions of enslaved men in Georgia and South Carolina. Due to the threat of the British invasion, Hamilton wrote, an essential part of the plan is to give them their freedom with their muskets. But Washington had grave reservations and did not give his full support. And we will find, if I was talking about Hamilton, I could tell about some of his story where he has some prejudice of his own. The Continental Congress unanimously passed a resolution in 1779. We don't have Congress, Senate, presidency at this point, offering enslavers in Georgia and South Carolina up to $1,000 for each enslaved man who enlisted, and stated that those who served until the end of the war would be emancipated. One delegate, William Whipple of New Hampshire, said that the plan could lay a foundation for the abolition of slavery in America. The legislatures of Georgia and South Carolina refused to allow slave men to become soldiers, and Washington wrote to Lawrence, "The spirit of freedom, which at the commencement of this contest would have gladly sacrificed everything to the attainment of its objective, has long since subsided, and every selfish passion has taken its place." And that just gives you a little feel for what went on during the Revolutionary War. Washington arrived in New York City in April 1789. The war is over. He's returned to Mount Vernon. He doesn't even get 3 years when he is nominated and then elected as president. And there's no Washington, D.C. There is no building for the president in New York City or perhaps in Philadelphia. And Washington really did not want to be president. And no matter what they tell you, he never turned down the chance to be king. That is not true. That's a story. Well, he arrived in New York City in April of 1789, and he moved his household into a large private home on Cherry Street. He rented the home for 1 year from Samuel Osgood. Although roomy, the house barely held all the people crammed inside, and they were crammed inside. George and Martha would join him later on with some of her enslaved, their grandchildren, Nellie and Wash, Tobias Lear, who is Washington's private secretary, who actually is from New Hampshire, other secretaries, and about 10 white or free black paid servants that worked and may have boarded in the home, and enslaved individuals as well. And it was crammed. Roughly 10 enslaved people, maybe not at all one time, worked at the president's houses in New York City and Philadelphia, and I'll explain that remark in a moment. So that's the house on the top of your screen, top left. And I'll talk a little bit more about the second house, but it was so cramped. The enslaved, if they were watching children, they had to walk by George and Martha's bedroom. Not a good environment for anyone. Everything that happened in the houses depended on enslaved labor. A mansion at 6 and Market Streets in Philadelphia was the executive mansion for the first 2 presidents of the United States, while the permanent capital was being built in D.C. After 16 months in New York City, George Washington lived in the president's house in Philadelphia from November 1790 to March 1797. John Adams occupied it from March 1797 to June 1800. And yes, president's term of office began in March back then, not January. And Adams became the first president to occupy the White House. And while we're on that topic, Adams is the only one of the first 5 presidents that did not enslave people. So you have Washington, then we skip over Adams, you have Jefferson, you have Madison, you have Monroe, and there are others as well beyond that. So that is a somewhat bigger building here in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is a very different place than New York, as you'll soon find out. So while Washington's here, he would go back to Mount Vernon, as would Martha periodically, and there were still many enslaved people living on the Mount Vernon estate. The enslaved taken to New York in 1789 to 1790, Ona, Hercules, Giles, Austin, who happened to be Ona's half-brother, Richmond, who is Hercules' son, Paris, Joe, Christopher Shields, and William Lee. I mentioned this before, but I want to say it again. In 1799, in 62 years, we're going to have a civil war about enslavement. as one of the leading causes of it. There were 317 men, women, and children enslaved at Mount Vernon's 5 farms, which consisted now of 8,000 acres, because you read 2,000 earlier. They made up more than 90% of the estate's population. And this is the Alexander Macomb House. And that was the second home they lived in New York, which was a little bigger as well as the one that was cramped. So there's no, all those buildings we have in DC today, none of that existed. Not as many cabinet posts, but there were still people that needed places to be. I have not been here, but I am told it's not far from the Liberty Bell, and it's the site of the President's House in Philadelphia. And this will tell you the enslaved that were there, and it's on a wall. Austin, Paris, Hercules, Christopher Shields, Richmond, Giles, Oni Judge. Her name was Ona, but the Washingtons frequently called her Oni, Moll, and Joe. And Moll would have helped with the children. And there's like the outline of the president's home, and there's some parts of the foundation there. And if you look here, that signifies Ona Judge's footsteps, because something important will happen here in Philadelphia regarding her. And I will tell you soon. Let me tell you quickly about this painting. George Turnbull painted the 1780 painting of George Washington, and it depicts William Lee, an enslaved man who was Washington's body servant during the Revolutionary War. William Lee remained enslaved by Washington until the conditions of Washington's will granted him freedom in 1799. And this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. And no, William Lee did not wear that headgear. That was one of those fanciful things in art that they sometimes did, trying to give the person a different look, at least as far as his head wear was concerned. In 1768, Washington purchased William Lee and his brother Frank from Mary Lee, a wealthy widow. William and Frank Lee, they were called mulatto. That was a word that was used then, or mixed race. William and Frank most likely had a white father and an enslaved mother. And I just want to point this out, that women did not have the power over their bodies, or control. Let me reword that: control over their bodies. If a white man wanted them, that's what happened. They became pregnant. I don't know this particular story, but I know a lot of women who were enslaved women that were Black or mixed race. They had children by a white man or their white enslaver. To get back to this story, Frank was a butler and a valet, and William was a valet. And for almost 20 years, William Lee went with Washington nearly everywhere. As a manservant or valet, Lee assisted his master. That's not my wording. That's what it was at the time. Unfortunately, that word sends chills up my spine, so I'm going to say enslaver, with a multitude of responsibilities. Among them, delivering messages, laying out clothes, tying a silk ribbon around his hair because they wore a ponytail or a queue. He was an excellent horseman and an athlete, and Lee also rode in Washington's fox hunts that they had frequently in Virginia, and he oftentimes had a French horn slung over his shoulder for the fox hunt. He was also responsible. I don't think there's any more about him. Oh, yes, I'll keep on going. He was also responsible for organizing the general's personal affairs, including his voluminous messages. He had so many archives, so many papers. He held a spyglass. I'll tell you more. Here's a picture saying George Washington crossing the Delaware. Guess what? There are so many mistakes in this painting, but artist preference. This falls short. Lee was with Washington during the American Revolutionary War and sold soldiers during a brutal, and I mean a brutal winter during Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1777 to 1778. He was also said to be in New Jersey with Washington at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. He galloped near Washington all the way to the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia in 1781. William was entrusted to carry Washington's private and public papers, and on the battlefield, he was armed with a pistol, carbine, and spyglass. But because he was enslaved by Washington, he could not serve as a regular soldier in the Continental Army. How did some manage to do that? I cannot tell you. So historically speaking, this picture, which is Washington crossing the Delaware, you've seen this before, or one similar to it. It's dated 1851, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It falls short because it was painted 75 years after the Revolutionary War. There are several mistakes here, including the furled stars and stripes. The Continental troops, there's no United States of America at this time, flew the Grand Union. We're trying to obtain our freedom. The conditions of the crossing took place around midnight. Doesn't look like midnight there. Amid a snowstorm, Alabama hard to capture, and the vessels Washington's men crossed in larger flat-bottomed Durham boats than this one portrayed here. And the river, the Delaware, is not as wide as where they crossed. And this gentleman over here is supposed to be William Lee right there. And this is found in the National Gallery of Art, the Washington family in the National Gallery of Art. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to tell you a little bit more about William Lee. And actually, in this painting, it was originally thought that this was William Lee, but then he was correctly identified as Christopher Shields. And I showed you the other painting, which showed him, they call it stylized dress. During the, I would say of any enslaved that Washington was close to and fond of, William Lee was it, but he was still enslaved. They spent 7 years in close proximity, and many people think that that helped change Washington's views very gradually and very, very much later on slavery. And he emerged with a newfound, he didn't like slavery, but what he did about it, he committed to not buying or selling them and to avoid separating them. But families were kept together, but some of them could have been in New York or Philadelphia, while others are in Virginia. During the Revolutionary War, Lee married a free Black woman named Margaret Thomas from Philadelphia, and she had worked for the Washington household as a seamstress. After the war, Lee asked his owner if he could, his enslaver, to bring Thomas to Mount Vernon, although that Washington grumbled he never wished to see her anymore, taking up Lee's time, apparently. He could not refuse, as he's lived with me says so long and followed my fortunes with fidelity. There's no evidence, however, that she actually ever lived at Mount Vernon. We know that she had been in ill health. I don't know if she passed away slightly before or after her, and she was due to arrive. The sad part of the story about William Lee is he has several accidents that damaged both of his knees. I mean, he was Washington's right-hand person. He insisted on traveling to New York to join Washington in his executive household. His condition got worse on the journey. He had to stop in Philadelphia, where he was fitted with braces. Washington's secretary knew that Lee wanted to be there and said if he's still anxious to come on here, the president would gratify him, although it will be troublesome. He has been an old faithful servant. That is enough for the president to grant him every reasonable wish. Though a determined Lee reached on New York 2 months later, soon became clear he was no longer able to physically act. As Washington's valet, he was sent back to Mount Vernon and became the state's shoemaker, working in the small cobbler shop behind the greenhouse. It's you don't know really about how Lee felt about Washington, whether it was from genuine affection or just to have a, a good position within the slave community. I don't, I can't speak to his end of the relationship. Certainly he liked being the valet. The demotion to a shoemaker was not something that he was happy about. When the he and by the way, Washington thinks that Lee is very fond of him. And one other thing I wanted to mention, originally, before the war, he's always referred to Billy, but afterwards he is known as William Lee. And he is very well known by people that associate, he was kind of a kind of famous figure because of his relationship with Washington. When the president retired, William Lee was the only enslaved person set free in his will. And he said he would provide him with an allowance of $30 for the rest of his life. This I give him as a testimony of my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful service during the Revolutionary War. Lee remained on the estate until his death in 1810, and he is believed to be buried in the Enslaved Cemetery in Mount Vernon. And one other thing I want to mention about William Lee is that unfortunately, I think due to all the things that happened to him, he acquired a fondness for drinking. Okay, here's the Washington family here. There's George, Martha, granddaughter Nellie, and grandson Wash. And this, for a long time, was thought to be William Lee, but this is Christopher Shields. And when I read the description of this painting, which is owned by the National Gallery of Art, it said that he was painted in shadow. But I was kept on, and this is a ginormous portrait. I mean, it's like 7 feet high, and I can't remember the width, but it's big and very ambitious. But I looked at it, and if you look, not only, yes, I do think that he was painted in later, but look, his features are so obscured, and it really bothered me. So my son is an art conservator and historian and numerous other art things. And so I asked him to just look at it. We were communicating over the phone. And he tried to explain it to me. And he said, and it was taken down to ground, which is meant like he's not on the ground. It was the way it was. One of the things is it's overzealously cleaned, and it was taken down to the basic color. I asked him if he thought he was added later, and he said because of the dark colors behind it, most likely he was added later in shadow, but the obscuring of his face, that's it's been over cleaned. It changes the colors. It goes back to the color that was originally there, which was probably a brown, and then he was added later on. And other things, if you keep on cleaning it, the whites will become whiter or more transparent. It's a degradation, and it's also a wax-lined painting. So it does have numerous issues, but unfortunately, Christopher Shields in this picture is not, his features have definitely been obscured. I do have an engraving where it didn't happen so much. And that suit that he is wearing is supposed to be red and white, though it could have been a reddish orange. It's called a livery suit, which is what happens, which people, especially valets or waiters or butlers, wore. Okay, let me tell you about this gentleman. This is Christopher Shields. Here he is with the Washington family. was one of the 8 to 10 enslaved taken from Mount Vernon to serve in the Washington's household. There were 10, but they weren't all there at the same time. He was a dour enslaved of the Custis family. Shields was the nephew of William Lee. I don't know, some places say nephew, some say relative. I'm not quite sure, but he worked as a waiter butler. And he was one of the few enslaved at Mount Vernon who was literate, who was taught to read and write. And when the capital moved to Philadelphia a year later, he was one of those who Washington secretly rotated out of Pennsylvania to avoid the 1780 law allowing enslaved people to claim their freedom after 6 months residency in the state. They were way ahead of New York. If they had been there over 6 months, then they were entitled to their freedom. And the Washingtons decide that they're going, along with Tobias Lear, Washington's personal secretary, that they will rotate people in and out and send them back to Virginia so they do not obtain their freedom. So in 1791, Shields returned to Mount Vernon, where he worked as a carpenter. When Washington and his family returned to Virginia after his second term ended in 1797, Shields was transferred back to the house because otherwise that carpenter was not as an esteemed a position. He took over the position of Washington's valet or personal manservant. 3 incidents in Shields' life illuminate the suspicion that characterized the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved. Shields, on October 9th, 1797, was bitten by a rabid dog, and it was maybe Nellie Custis' spaniel Frisk who later died. Now, rabies, there really wasn't supposed to be a cure for it at that time, so he must have been terrified. And Washington sends him to a physician who claimed to treat rabies called hydrophobia with his signature Stoy's drops. And he lived in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, 150 miles away. And Washington sends a letter saying, do everything in your power to heal this young man. I'm anxious for his cure. And he administered the medicine and wrote to Washington that he could rest assured that Christopher is safe. Could he have really saved him with that? I don't think so. But Washington gave Shields $25 to cover his expenses, and he brought back about half of it. Did Washington's efforts to get medical help for Shields indicate genuine affection? We don't know. By 1799, Shields had married an enslaved woman owned by Colonel Roger West, whose plantation was a few miles north of Mount Vernon. Although the marriage wasn't legal under Virginia law, Washington recognized and approved of the union until he discovered a note from the woman to Shields detailing plans to run away together. You can imagine how that went over. So their plan was unfolded, and it was foiled. No other references appear. We don't know what happened. I'm going to guess there was some kind of punishment. If he was, it didn't include the demotion because he retains his position as his valet and some of his the enslavers' trust. Just 3 months later, December 2014, oh man, 1814, Shields stood at Washington's bedside as the retired president battled a throat infection. Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear, was there as well, and he recalled that Shields stayed with the president throughout the day. In the afternoon, Lear recounted, the general, observing that Christopher had been standing at his bed for a long time, made a motion for him to sit in a chair which stood by the bedside. He sat. When Washington succumbed to his illness late that night, Shields was one of 4 enslaved people in the room, along with the housemaids Carolyn Branham, Charlotte, and Molly. After his master died, enslaver died, Washington died. Shales removed Washington's keys and personal effects from his pockets and gave them to a grief-stricken Tobias Lear. Because he owned the Custis, was owned by the Custis estate. Remember, these belonged to Martha's grandchildren upon her death. Shales was not freed in George Washington's will. Instead, at Martha's death in 1802, he was probably inherited by her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who lived at Arlington House. You know where Arlington House is? You know where Arlington Cemetery is? And at the top of that hill, there's a home owned by a famous couple, well-known couple. Then, about 27 years old, Shields was valued at the considerable sum at the time of 120 pounds. His younger sister, Judy, was also sent to Arlington House and eventually became a nanny to the children of Custis's daughter, Mary, and her husband, Robert E. Lee. Mary is the daughter of George and Martha Washington's grandson. And Mary Washington is married to Robert E. Lee, the man who commanded the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. And that house will be seized by the government, and it is never returned to the Lee/Washington Custis families. Many people are buried in the Arlington Cemetery, and the house still stands at the top of that hill. And there's the engraving. And when I was talking to my son, I noticed a lot of different things here, and I'm going to move myself because of the person I wanted to show the most is right here. So this is engraving owned by the Met. And it hasn't been, obviously it's an engraving. It was not cleaned like the other one. And it was actually done by the artist. And some things are different. There's not the other map underneath here. And though not perfect, though painted in shadow, Christopher Shields' face is much more clearly viewed, and I wanted you to be able to see that. Couple more stories here. Hercules, and many times his last name isn't used, but we know that someday he will be known as Hercules Posey, was born somewhere between 1747 and 1749. And before becoming the property of George Washington, he was enslaved by Washington's neighbor, Posey. John Posey owed a debt to George Washington and acquired Hercules as a settlement of the debt, which included 26 enslaved individuals, including Hercules. By 1786, Hercules was a cook at Mount Vernon, and he apprenticed with one of the Washington's chef's cooks. He would have apprenticed under the older enslaved chefs, Dahl and Nathan. And he likely started out doing scullery work until he worked his way up to master chef, working 16-hour days to prepare elaborate meals for his enslaver. And he was noted for his work in the kitchen. And this is a silhouette from Mount Vernon that made it based on what someone in his position during that time period that was enslaved would have worn. Hercules married Alice, a seamstress in Mount Vernon, and Alice was a dower slave owned by Martha Washington's first husband's estate and is referred to in the Washington accounts as Lane. Their wedding date is unknown, but Alice gave birth to their son Richmond in 1777 and daughters Delilah and Eve, who was apparently a very diminutive person. There's a reference to that in the records. And because Alice was Martha Washington's dower property, her children also belonged to Martha Washington's family, while their father Hercules belonged to George Washington. Alice died in 1878. 3 years after Alice's death, The capital relocated from New York City to Philadelphia. In November 1790, Washington summoned Hercules to cook meals in the president's house. In Philadelphia, Hercules became well known. He produced elaborate multi-course meals for Washington, the family, and politicians. So, as advised by the Attorney General, the first couple rotated Hercules and others out of Pennsylvania every 6 months. We talked about that before. And eventually he's convincing the Washingtons that he should be allowed to stay longer because Hercules had learned of the plan to rotate them in and out, and he convinced them, expressing dismay that he was not trusted. And he pledged his loyalty and attachment to the family. So Mrs. Washington allowed him to remain in the city. Had he chosen to do so, he could have pressed his right to freedom at any time after that stay in 1791. Yet he did not. However, the door to self-emancipation from Philadelphia closed, went on a trip to Mount Vernon with the Washington family. This is what happens. In the summer of 1796, so this is going to be, his son is born in 1777. He's about 29 years old. His son is accused, his son Richmond, of stealing money from a white servant. Washington believed the theft was part of a plan by Richmond and his father to fund an escape. Seems so. Guess what? His son was punished, and this makes Hercules decide to attempt to escape. And he does it in dramatic fashion. He designed his escape to serve as a symbol of how enslaved felt about their status. Hercules had been sent back to Mount Vernon in preparation for Washington's return. But in Washington's absence, there wasn't enough need for fancy meals. And so Hercules had been put to work digging for bricks, which he thought was beneath him and his talent, which it was. So on February 20th and 21st, he worked laying bricks. And then he took off on February 22nd, George Washington's birthday. Now, as a chef, Hercules was accorded some privileges, but he was still enslaved, remember. He could sell the leftover slops from the kitchen, leftover food. He actually did receive a salary, and he probably used this money to finance his escape. He was reportedly, and so he did. He took off. And for years, people didn't know what happened to them. But people working in conjunction with a museum from Connecticut, with Mount Vernon, with people working in other places, uncovered this, that Hercules actually was hiding in plain sight. He'd gone back to New York City, and he had taken the last name Posey, which was that of his first enslaver. And he appears in a directory there. 3 or 4 different years. One year he's listed, you had to pay to have your name put in it. He is listed as a cook, the other years as a laborer, but he was alive, and he most likely died on May 15th, 1812, buried at the Second African Burying Ground in Lower Manhattan. And I think they have done something that helps detect if there is a body there. And yes, there was. So that's most likely where he was, hiding in plain sight. Before that, he had never gone by a last name. His daughter, Eve, was asked if she was sad that her father she would never see her father again. And that was by a French visitor to Mount Vernon. And she replied that she was very glad because now he is free. And yes, he was, but we don't know what he looked like. Now, here's another story. This was for a long time. This 18th century portrait was considered to be Hercules. It's an older painting, but somehow when it was purchased in 1977, it was labeled as the chef of George Washington, Hercules. Now, there's a couple of problems. No, at that time in the 1820s, would he have been wearing a chef's toque? That would not have happened. This is most likely headgear of a person that lived in Dominica, which is not the Dominican Republic. And this actually was loaned, this portrait, to Mount Vernon 2017. And all these people convened because this belongs to a museum in Spain. And they determined a couple things. Number one, it was thought that this was a painting by Gilbert Stewart, who did the famous painting of Washington. This is not him. And this was not even a cook. Somehow along the way, though it wasn't in the original historic record, this label was attached to it. And so this is not true. It could have been an African servant or an enslaved attendant of a wealthy British citizen. He's got a fine suit on, we're told. But you know what? It's not. It never was him. And for all this time, for like 40 years, it was thought to be not painted by Stewart and not the chef of George Washington. And now, thanks to the research that people done, we know what happened to Hercules. The executive director of the Westport Historical Society and her archive manager, Sarah Keynes, and people that had records in the burying ground. And now we know what happened. We don't know exactly who this man is, but we now know that it's not Hercules. And here's the person that inspired me to do this story. And I wish I could have talked about so many more, because during the Revolutionary War, at least 30 enslaved escaped, and there are many more names and stories to be told. So I hope this will encourage you to do further reading. And this right here is the book that came out in 2017, and it is called Never Caught: The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. And I did read it. It is an excellent book. Some of her story has to be pieced together by the events that were happening and people around the Washingtons and people around them. But Ona also will tell her own story. So I did put the cover here because I would encourage you to buy the book and read the story yourself. Ona Judge was born in 1773 to Betty, an enslaved seamstress for Martha Washington, who belonged to the Custis estate. So she was a dowager enslaved, and a white indentured servant from England, a tailor, Andrew Judge. Ona, because of the status of their mother, Ona and her two half siblings, Austin and Delphi, were also dower enslaved. And so he was indentured, eventually gets his freedom, the father, and eventually gets paid, stays a little longer, and then he doesn't seem to be in their lives. And I don't know their relationship, if it was consensual or forced, because even though he was indentured, He was indentured, but he was a white man. So tragically, that gives him over an enslaved woman. She had older siblings, and she had two half siblings, Austin and Delphi, who were also dower enslaved. And I just wanted to quickly, I didn't put him on a slide, but I did want to tell a little bit about her brother Austin. And his mother brought him to the Mount Vernon when Martha and George married. He was a baby. Austin was a baby, so he's a little older than Ona. And the identity of his father isn't known. He's of mixed racial heritage, and he might have worked as a waiter, and might have been a footman. And during the Revolutionary War, he may have been accompanying Martha to one of her trips to her husband in the field. He was trusted to make long rides on his own. He married another dower slave from Mount Vernon, possibly a seamstress named Charlotte. They're not really sure. And Austin seemed to have been a stable worker, and he might have had 5 children, but he died tragically on December 20th, 1794, after a fall from a horse. So some people said he had a widow and 5 children. Other people are not sure. And his children were inherited by George Washington Parke Custis, and then probably moved to Arlington House. It does not know what came of his widow. And Delphi, we will see, will remain with the Washington family and be passed on to the granddaughters. At the age of 9 or 10, Ona, or Oni, as they referred to her, was brought to the main house. And some of the things vary just a little bit. Here and there, some differences. And here, the most recent research said she was trained as a seamstress. So she started at that, and then became Martha Washington's personal attendant, personal maid. And Washington became president. Ona only was 16, and she traveled with the other enslaved to New York, the president's residence, first in New York and then in Philadelphia. And she was one of the enslaved people who Washington secretly rotated in and out of Philadelphia to avoid the 1780 Pennsylvania Emancipation Law. And Washington asked his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to achieve this with the enslaved being unaware so they wouldn't object or cause difficulty of the reason it was done. And in Philadelphia, there was also a large free Black community where Ona had friends. And this is at the president's house. I showed you a picture before, but this is a panel on a wall. And on May 21st, 1796, enslaved maid, and she did so many personal tasks for Mrs. Washington. And I just want to say something. Some people think, why would you leave? Because you wore pretty nice clothes, and you could do things, and you didn't have to worry about meals or anything like that. I'll let her answer this question for you later on. She escaped from the president's house, and you can see here it says, "I'm free now." Judge had just learned that Mrs. Washington, she informed her she was going to give Ona to her granddaughter, Eliza Custis Law, as a wedding present. She was Eliza Custis at the time. And there's no way. All of the Washington grandchildren, Martha Washington's grandchildren, had a reputation for being rather indulged and spoiled and unkind. And when she heard that, there was no way she was going to stay with her. So in her 1845 interview, and I'll talk more about that later, whilst they were packing to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty, my freedom. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, and I had my things carried there beforehand and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner. And she took quite the risk for freedom. I want you to think about that, something we take for granted. And if you go back and look at pictures of the president's house, there are those photograph that shows the footprints in the ground. And those are the footprints embedded in the ground representing Ona's Flight to Freedom. How does she escape Philadelphia? And this is a children's book. And it's called Runaway, The Daring Escape of Ona Judge. I don't think I'm going to be able to put it up here so you can see it, but maybe you can see the cover a little bit. And there's several children books and books for middle school and a middle school version of the book I showed you earlier. Anyway, I wanted to show you we do not have photographs or paintings of Ona, but I wanted you to see. And in this verse, it says, Ona Judge, why you run away? And she did. She ran away and she was given a ride on a ship by a ship captain named Bowles. And for many years, she did not share that story. Do you know why? Because she was trying to protect him. He gave her a ride to where he was originally from, which was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And in the Black community, that was rather small. This is in New Hampshire. She was sheltered by them. And she met a man named in 1797, a free Black named Jack Staines, and they moved into their own home. They had 3 children, Eliza, Will, and Nancy. And Staines was a sailor, and although the pay was good, it was sporadic and seasonal. And to help make ends meet, Ona continued domestic work, and they also took in a boarder. But what happens? Absconded from the President of the United States, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled with very black eyes and bushy black hair, middle stature and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. She has many good clothes of all for, but they are not sufficiently recollected to be, I can't read all these words, as there was no suspicion of her going off. So she had nice clothes. We didn't think she was going to escape. It is not easy to conjecture whether she has gone or fully or what her design is, but they may attempt by water. All matters of vessels are cautioned against admitting her into them, though it's probable that they will attempt to pay for a free woman and has paid wherewithal to pay her passage. $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home if taken in the city. Frederick Kit Stewart. It's not a very clear copy, but you get the idea. And many years later, and this is how her story comes to be told, when a reporter asked why she chose that moment to escape, Ona said she was determined never to be her slave, referring to Eliza. So you know her reputation. She escaped on a ship, Nancy, commanded by Captain John Bowles, headed for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She revealed, I never told his name until after he died a few years since, lest they should punish him for bringing me away. Once she arrived in Portsmouth, she did find lodging with a free Black family and obtained work as a household servant. And I've gone by this house many times, and I was in Portsmouth in June, and I've taken pictures of this before, and it's the home of Governor John Langdon in Portsmouth. And Washington attempted, as you can see, to recapture her. He discovered her whereabouts when Elizabeth Langdon, the daughter of Senator John Langdon and Governor John Langdon, the same person, and a friend of Martha Washington's granddaughter, happened to see Ona in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And Langdon told Washington, and the president requested the assistance of Joseph Whipple, collector of customs in Portsmouth. Whipple spoke to Judge. He found her. Portsmouth was about 5,000 people then, asking her to board a ship to return to her life of being enslaved. And she told Whipple that she would return if she were freed upon the deaths of George and Martha. Remember, she is a dower enslaved. And the Custis grandchildren are not going to agree to her freedom either. And they refused. Otherwise, she said she should rather suffer death than return to slavery and liable to be sold or given to any other person. There was no seduction by a Frenchman, that was one of the rumors, but rather a thirst for complete freedom had been her only motive for absconding. And what is interesting to me is that she grants 2 interviews. Most enslaved were not interviewed. And this is just to give you an idea of the length of the interviews. You can look them up and find them. I put them up here for you to see. She was briefly enticed into telling her story in 1845 in the Granite Freedom. You can find it online. But you know, Washington doesn't stop. He's going to send his nephew next to capture her. And he shows up. And she said, I am free to go and choose to remain so. And she told her would-be kidnapper in Portsmouth, because he sends Martha's nephew to get her. And this person announces his plans at the home of Senator John Langdon. Remember, his daughter tells where Ona is. And he's in New Hampshire. And a sympathetic Langdon secretly sends a messenger to warn Judge with her husband at sea and Eliza in her arms. She goes to her friend Nancy Jack's house, though he did show up at her door, but she escapes, and Bassett goes back to Virginia empty-handed. He cannot find her again. And after Washington's death, Judge said that family never troubled me anymore. She remained an escapee. She was legally, sadly, still owned by the Custis family. And she lost her 2 daughters. Her husband had died. We don't know when. Maybe her son had died. And she moved to Greenland, which is about 8 miles from Portsmouth. And she said that even though she was a pauper and received support from the county, Rockingham County, she said that she never, that her life was better. She had never received the least mental or moral instruction from the Washington family. She was never taught to read. But after she came to Portsmouth, she learned to read. And when Elias Smith preached in Portsmouth, she professes to have been converted to Christianity. She likely never saw her Mount Vernon family again. Her mother, her sister was inherited by Eliza, the very person that she escaped from. And Ona Judge asked if she had any regret, as one interview noted, when she asked if she's not sorry she left Washington because her life was so much harder. She said, "No, I am free, and I trust, been made a child of God by the means." And she died in 1848. And Washington, in his will, several months before his death, there it is, and left directions for the eventual emancipation of enslaved people he owned. At the passing of Martha Washington, of the 317 that he owed, 123 enslaved were owned by him and were eligible to be freed based on the terms of Washington's will. Once Martha died, by law, neither George nor Martha could free the people owned by the Custis estate. And when Martha ends up freeing the people that were eligible to be freed, I'm afraid it's probably not out of any great altruism, but the fact is that she was afraid of what would happen if she did not. So she did free them. And there was the remaining enslaved were divided among the Custis grandchildren in 1799. There were elderly enslaved, those that were too sick to be supported by his estate. They were supported by estate and perpetuity. And I butchered that word, but apparently near the end of his life, and not enough, he was questioning definitely slavery. And Martha does file in December 1800 a deed of manumission release from slavery for Georgia's enslaved people. His one servant, William Lee, was freed sooner than that. I told you about his life. And they finally, everyone would be freed that was eligible to be on January 1st, 1801. So let me stop this. Let me just go on a little bit. And I read you that one, and I told you those two quotes. And if you go visit Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they have got the Black Heritage Trail has guided walking tours, and they tell the story of Ona Judge. Do a Google, search it. I think on their building, they're going to put a mural of Ona, and it's a story of freedom, and it's a story of families that were bound to hers, and it's Ona's story. And I hope that if I lived up in New Hampshire, I would be there to see it enacted and told. And the story comes to life in this tour, I have no doubt. Here's my sources. There's a ton of them. There's even more out there. Sometimes they conflict a little bit, but the spirit of the story is the same. I want to thank Ms. Jackson, Ms. Joanna Jackson, who reached out to ask if she could help me. Her family home is being moved to Greenfield Village, the Jackson House. Look it up. It'll open in a couple of years. I appreciate her support, and I appreciate you who join me every month. Thank you so much. See you next month.